Hey everyone, Dale and I were talking about kind of my background and throwing out some ideas about what might be interesting to the members of this group as to, basically who are the groups that are doing are hacking other organizations or businesses, and what are they after? How do they do it? And what can we do to protect ourselves a little bit? And so I'm just going to go through a few videos here talking about this. And this first one, I'm just going to talk about who the attackers are and what their motivation is. Why are they doing this? Now, typically when we think of a hacker, if you've been around for a while, you are thinking in terms of somebody sitting in a basement, some kid somewhere in their parents' basement hacking because they can, and just kind of the stereotypical type of hacker. These folks they're still around. They don't make the news in particular anymore. They're kind of like somebody taking your computer for a joyride, and they can be destructive or at least a little disruptive, but that's usually not their primary goal. It's almost like collecting Pokemon cards. Got to collect them all. They're doing it because they can. Sophistication levels vary quite a bit here. So that's the first group. The next one are what I would call the activist or hacktivist, as you'll hear them called online sometimes. These folks decide that the business or organization they're targeting, their victim, has angered them in some way because they are upset about something relating to a cause that they're upset about. This could be geopolitical, this could be economic, this could be all kinds of things. For example, denial of service attacks against payment card processors like Visa were done because some hacktivists decided they didn't like them. There's something going on that they got upset about. These folks are almost always destructive, or at least disruptive in some way. That's their goal. They want to deface somebody's website to make it, to spread some kind of message, get publicity, that sort of thing. So very much destructive. Their sophistication, how good they are, usually isn't great. Sometimes they've got some skill, but opportunistic. They're not opportunistic. They're like I said, they're after somebody because they're bent at them and angry, but they typically are destructive again. Now, the next group are really skilled, typically, and these are teams that are sponsored by countries. These are things like military units or intelligence teams that have been tasked with getting information, preparing an area for an attack that they're, maybe going to carry out a military operation, and so they want to crash the power grid at about the same time that they launch an attack. Russians have done that in places like Georgia. When they took over the Crimea Peninsula, I believe they did that against the Ukraine. Russians are known for that sort of stuff. These are folks who are really good at what they do. And you have the Russians, the Chinese. Quite frankly, the United States does this as well. Has teams that are tasked with gathering information, espionage. Right. Most of the time, these groups aren't. They're trying to get access to be prepared for some kind of tasking that they may get, or they've been tasked to go get some information, and so they go out and gain access to some organization's network, and they're trying to steal information for economic advantage or political advantage or something like that. They typically don't want to be spotted, so they're not terribly disruptive for the most part. They come in, they look, see what's going on, and they leave. As far as who they'll go after, most of the time you have, their victims are some reason a target because of, some kind of alignment with their country that's of interest to them. In this group, probably very few of us would fit into this category. Maybe a few folks, depending on their business. But, like I said, they very skilled if you get targeted. It can be really brutal. I have seen a small media organization in Southeast Asia being targeted by a Chinese unit that, you just feel bad every time you see it happen because these guys are just the company is like 50 people and they've got a very sophisticated team coming after them. So In that case, like I said, it was media, and so the Chinese are very concerned with controlling the message and stuff, and that's probably why they got attention from the Chinese government. So again, not terribly destructive, very good at what they do, unless, they'll get destructive if there's like a war going on or something like that. But they typically don't burn things to the ground. The Iranians will do that sometimes, depending on who their target is. The last group is the one that really are the folks that we need to be concerned about, probably here in this group, and these are the criminal groups. And these are folks that are after money in some way. And so what they will do is they will go in and they'll break into somebody's environment, and they will encrypt all of the data that's important to this company, and then they'll hold it for ransom. Say, you have to pay us $10,000 to get this back or more. I talked to one gentleman who owns a company that said when he was hit with a ransom, he paid about $100,000 to get his systems decrypted. And I'll talk about that a little bit on the backup and recovery area as far as more preparations, but that's how expensive this can get. Sometimes it can go even much more, 7 figures for some of these ransoms. Colonial Pipeline, that was the oil pipeline back east that was shut down for a little while in 2021. In their case, their billing systems were ransomed, and they paid off like $4 or $5 million in cryptocurrency to get their data back, so that they could then transact and send oil along and get paid for that. Anyhow, this group is very opportunistic. You've got folks that are scanning the internet all the time looking for remote access methods into companies, and then trying to abuse that and get into their network. I'll talk a little bit more about access in the next video, but they'll go for anybody. Honestly, these folks are the people we all need to be concerned about. Maybe they'll hack your website or what have you, and use that as a mechanism to get into your network. So my dad and I were talking about some of these groups actually about a month ago, and he made the comment that he wouldn't be an interesting target because his data is not terribly interesting to an attacker. And I said, well, that's not the way to look at this. Your data is important to you, and you've got a little bit of money. So all they have to do is deny you the access to your data and say, I'll give it back to you if you pay up. Or they'll say, we've stolen your data and we'll release it publicly unless you pay us. So a little bit of extortion there. There are other mechanisms that they use to commit crimes. Actually, Eagle Mountain just got hit with one where somebody managed to convince them to make a wire transfer that they shouldn't have. That was part of an email attack. I'll talk about that in the next video as well. But again, this is very opportunistic. See if we can just steal whatever we can get out of them. These are the folks that we all need to be concerned about and keeping an eye out for. So those are the different types of attackers that are predominantly out there and what they're interested in. Again, for us here in this group, most of the time we're going to be concerned about the criminal actors. You could end up with a stereotypical hacker breaking into an environment because they decided to, or a hacktivist if you were associated with some cause that they didn't like, or some business or something like that. That could become an issue, but they typically go for something flashy. And then countries, obviously, again, that somebody has tasked them with going out and getting information inside of an organization for diplomatic, political, or economic advantage. So yeah, I'm gonna focus probably mostly in how the attacks happen and stuff on the e-crime side of things in the next video. So anyhow, let's move on. All right, now that we know who is doing the attacking, let's talk about how they do it. And I'm going to talk about 3 methods that are primarily used in most intrusions. Not to say that there aren't other ways that this happens, but these are the 3 that I see most of the time in my work. Probably the one you see and hear about the most are the email type of attacks or email scams. This could be a phishing message where they tell you there's been a problem with a bank transfer and they want you to go to a website and type in your banking credentials, or they have a zip file with a malicious file in it that's pretending to be a PDF document, and they want you to open up the zip file, try and open the PDF. You're actually executing a program that gives them access to your system. But they'll play on fear. They'll say, oh my goodness, something terrible is going to happen unless you pay up or unless you click this. There's been a problem with your Amazon transactions and stuff. You've got to come in and click this link, and they'll take you to something malicious in essence and try and get some information from you, or try and get you to execute something that will give them access to your computer. Another one that happened, I mentioned in the last video, is Eagle Mountain just got hit really this week. I saw it in the news on KSL, where the attacker managed to get themselves into an email chain about some project that was going on, and spoofed or took over somebody's email account and sent out a message to the city of Eagle Mountain and said, hey, I'm from accounting and we need you to transfer this money. Here's the routing information to transfer, like it was $1 million and change that was transferred out and stolen from Eagle Mountain. So you'll see these where you'll get a message from they'll say, hey, I'm the CEO of your company, or I'm the CFO. I can't get to email right now, but or I can't call you right now, but I need you to send this money over to this vendor over here, and here's their routing information. And as soon as you execute the ACH transfer, the money is gone at that point. Again, these folks, they play to fear. They want you to stop thinking critically about this because something bad is about to happen if you don't respond to this. And that's what they're playing with. They're playing with our emotions. And so anytime you see an email that starts to play to that, to make you think that something is going to go wrong, or somebody, if you don't do this, that's when you want to be really wary, double check. At worst, you talk to somebody, your IT provider or something like that, or somebody on your IT staff and say, hey, does this look legit? What's going on here? And you can find out about that. Get some help, really, is what I'm saying there. The next one is some kind of application compromise, and this can happen in a lot of ways. One that's really common are websites, running on a web server somewhere, or an email server. There's a vulnerability in it, which basically is a weakness that they have an attack for, and they'll use that to get some level of access into the system and try and then just move into your environment further. In the case of e-crime groups, this is where they would get initial access. They would try and find other systems, maybe get more usernames and passwords somehow, and they have various techniques for that. And they'll try and get deeper and figure out where your billing database is, and so then they'll encrypt your billing database, or data that you use for part of your service to your customers. We'll encrypt all of that up. And they'll demand some kind of payment for that, or they'll steal it, download it, and say, if you don't pay up, we'll publish this out to the internet. So yeah, this is a case where, again, this is a vulnerability that hasn't been patched. Custom web applications can really be a problem here, but also things like if you're running WordPress for your website, you need to make sure that you're keeping that up to date, because there's all kinds of vulnerabilities in the plugins frequently that they're constantly doing updates. And I use WordPress for my website. I'm not trying to dump on WordPress, but it's just one of those things where it is targeted heavily. The final attack, and this one's really common, and they just go after passwords. And they do this a couple of different ways. Let's say you have a VPN to get into your office network, and all it requires is you to type in your username and password. And what they will do is they'll just sit there and password guess like crazy on this. It's a program. Nobody's typing and doing anything. It's just a program just sending hundreds of requests very fast and trying to brute force their way in. And password guessing works really well. I've done penetration tests where I have used Spring 2022 exclamation point with a capital S on Spring. Spring 2022 exclamation point is longer than 8 characters. It's got an uppercase, it's got numbers in it, and it's got a special character. it meets all the password complexity requirements, and I'll guess with that, and I'll get 6 accounts that will allow me to get in. And of course, I'll change that because spring 2022 is in the past. So now I'd probably be using winter 2022 or autumn 2022 or exclamation point or something like that. Anyhow, they do these password guessing attacks. They get into an initial system. VPN, if you've ever dealt with remote desktop, which is where you can connect to the desktop of another computer over the internet using the remote desktop connection client on Windows. I've seen businesses that will just publish that out to the internet, and they'll say, well, nobody's going to find this. I'm just one little server out here, so nobody will find this. Well, unfortunately, there's massive scans being done to look for remote desktop protocol, that remote desktop connection. And once they find it, they start password guessing. Once they get a level of access into it, they log in, and it just looks like a login event. And then they start doing stuff to pivot and move through your environment and through your network and getting to data. Another area where they get in is password reuse. I'm sure you've gotten notifications from various companies saying, hey, your username and password was compromised, but don't worry, they haven't accessed any critical data like your credit card or anything like that. But that information gets kept and gets sold, again, through this economy, through the e-crime groups, and just gets stored out on the internet. And of course, the state-sponsored groups will just go and use that too. They'll just go buy access to somebody's password list that they've stolen. Anyhow, they'll get a hold of that, and because passwords suck to remember, and we have to change them all the time and stuff, we tend to reuse passwords. And so, by compromising over here on, I don't know, some e-commerce website, and somebody uses that in their, for their work account, it gets reused, and that will just be picked up, guessed again with software. We'll make the guesses, and then they log in, and so those are the 3 mechanisms primarily where you're seeing attacks happen. Like I said, there are other ways of doing it, but these are really simple to do, and are very, very common. So that's how they get in. And once they're in, then it's about whatever their goal is. Again, if it's a country, they're looking for information typically. If it's an e-crime group, they're going to try and steal from you in some way, and maybe bring your business to its knees in the process of it. So you want to be very wary of that because they are absolutely heartless with it. All right, next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about defenses. So we'll see you over there. All right, so we've covered a lot. We've talked about who's doing the attacking and why, and we've talked about how they do it, at least 3 common methods, most common methods for the different types of attacks that are out there that are resulting in these data breaches we're reading about in the news. Next, let's talk about defense. Now that I've alarmed you a bit, let's talk about what we can do. Particularly with e-crime, most of the time this is opportunistic. They're not really looking for anybody in particular. They're just looking for somebody that's easy. So our goal is to raise the bar of our defenses up so that it's not easy. It still can happen. It still happens at companies that are doing stuff for their security. But our goal is to essentially make it to where it's so time consuming or they're just hurt. They just move on. At least eliminate a lot of the low-lying stuff that these groups are using. So I talked about email as a mechanism for attack. Let's talk about email defense. One of the primary things we want to do is have good filtering, and I have run email systems where I was trying to set up filtering and stuff like that to prevent or protect our organization, the company I was working for. And it was a pain in the neck, I'll be honest with you. It is constantly back and forth. The bad guys are trying new stuff all the time, trying to figure out new ways of getting in, new ways of getting around the filters and stuff like that. So with filtering, I always recommend going for a service provider that this is what they do. And they do really good filtering rather than trying to maintain it yourself because it's really difficult. So there are a couple of options here that you can do. Google email, if you use Google Suites or G Suites or whatever they're calling it these days for your email, they have pretty good filtering. It has its problems. I see things, I use it. I see things get tossed into spam or junk or malicious or whatever that aren't, and I have to move them out. And I see things hit my inbox sometimes that are malicious, and I have to tell it, Google that, hey, this was spam, or was some kind of malicious thing. And so, but it catches a lot. And so that's a really useful service. Now, if you use Microsoft M365, I believe they're calling it nowadays, their email provider, they also have that that filtering in there. The implementation I've seen used recently, where I have access to another organization's emails because I do some stuff with them, it's a little hit and miss there. Maybe that's just the way they have it configured, but I don't have any view into that. But so it's, I'm not as big a fan there, but that may be a setting thing that's going on that I'm observing. On a large scale, and some folks are really dialed into what's going on with email attacks. There's a company named Proofpoint, Proof Point. That's their business, is email filtering, and they see a lot of stuff. All of the criminal stuff, nation state type of attacks. They've got a huge view into that world, and they also have very good service offerings. So, that is like the first thing that I would do to put in some defenses. The next area, and this one's difficult. We've all sat through the email, we've all sat through the video training about email security. Here's what a malicious email looks like. Don't click on this. Don't do that. Don't do the other. And then don't click on links in an email. And then, your employer sends out an email that has links in it for you to click. Anyhow, there is training out there to teach people to basically make them more aware of what's going on. And if we're more aware, we're more likely to not get suckered in. That said, it's really a tough one. Once something gets to somebody's inbox, when I was doing penetration testing, which is kind of like security testing, they hire me to see if they're vulnerable to stuff and what I can do. You'd always find people, if you got past the email filtering system, you would find somebody who would click. So you need to be prepared to respond to that, to have monitoring in place that would allow you to detect that when that fails, and so you can pick it up and try and contain the damage there. This is things like managed security service providers, MSSPs is what you'll hear it called. These folks are these service offerings are supposed to help you with your security if you don't have your own security team, and they can be really useful. With email, that's, make sure you got endpoint security on all of your desktops and that it is set up to block things properly, because again, things get passed. So make sure you've got that blocking set up. Things will get past the filtering. Somebody will click. And so we need to have that endpoint security there as well. Those things all assist us out in this process. The next one I'm going to talk about is the password guessing, because I really harped on that in the last video. And I talked about VPN, and I said if you have a VPN that just requires a username and password only, then all I have to do is guess what the username is, and I wrote a script one time that would do that, using things like LinkedIn, because we all have profiles there, and then to figure out what are the username combinations, like Jay Wood at this company. Cool, we've got a username. Now let's try passwords. And then they do a password guessing attack. So what we can do there is what's called multi-factor or dual factor or two-factor authentication. Most of the time they talked about it as multi-factor authentication now. This is a way, the idea here is you have a username, you have a password, and you have something that changes all the time, or some kind of code that is generated at the time that the login occurs to authorize it in a different channel than just something that somebody could guess at. Where you will see this happen a lot, or used a lot, I don't know if you've ever seen websites that use Google Authenticator. You've got a code that changes every minute. You type in your username, your password, and it'll prompt you for your authenticator code. And I go open up Google Authenticator, or Authy, which is another app that does this same type of thing. And I say, okay, my number is 123456. I type it in, hit enter, and it's randomly changing all the time and stuff like that, and it authorizes that and allows me to log in. That really breaks or defeats the password guessing attack, because now there's this third piece that's really difficult to do, to get around. Which is not to say that it can't be done, but we've upped the game an awful lot, and we've made it to where it's really much more difficult for this to happen. Another way that you see this happen, and this is frequently, like my bank does this all the time, you log in, username and password, and it says, hey, we sent you a text message with a unique code in it. Medical providers do this, all kinds of groups, PayPal, etc. They send you a text message that contains a code in it, and you type in that code just like you would if you had a Google Authenticator app or something like that, and it logs you in. It's fairly simple, and it's fairly effective. Most people know how to use this really quickly. They'll get a little bit annoyed because I have to do this extra step, but it is an effective defense. It can be gotten around, but it's expensive for the attackers to do it. And so they have to really want to do this. So again, we're just upping the game. And that's the goal here. There are service providers for this. If you wanted to look at integrating with it, Microsoft has that built into their cloud services to have an authenticator, that multi-factor authentication be added. Google uses that if you're using G Suites. All you do is go in and say, hey, require second factor authentication, and you go through the setup process, and now you have to punch in a code every time or not every time, but periodically to access your email and G Drive and things like that. There are other providers like Duo and Okta and Authy. Those are all also out there. Ping Identity, more expensive. So, it depends on the size of your environment and how concerned you are with wanting to really have a good solid multi-factor authentication setup. One of the things I would say, if you are putting something out on the internet that requires authentication, requires you to log in, use multi-factor on it. If that is a VPN, definitely put it on your VPN. You always want to have it on your VPN. I do not recommend just sticking a remote desktop out on the internet by any stretch. But if you do, for whatever reason, put multi-factor authentication on that. And, if you have a web app to log in and get your email and stuff like that, put multi-factor authentication on that. All of these are mechanisms where it will be attacked with password guessing attacks or password reuse attacks. And it'll be a real enhancement to your security by implementing that on top of it. All right, I've already gone 10 minutes in this video, so I'm going to go ahead and stop before I get into application attack and defenses there. So let's just stop it right here. We'll pick up again in the next video. All right, now let's talk about application attacks. I already talked a little bit about it in how they do the attacks. Let's take a look at this on some of the defensive side of things. First thing to understand, anytime you host anything out to the internet, no matter how tiny you are, it is under attack immediately. Years ago, when I was in college, I set up a server at my house so that I could connect remotely to my house. And when I say server, it was a PC running underneath my desk. Anyhow, immediately it was undergoing password guessing attacks. This was out of my house. It's just indiscriminate. So keep this in mind. Any app that you put online is under attack by something. So this is just the environment we live in. We've also dealt with this a lot with our Macintosh systems, our Windows systems, our Android devices, our iPhones, our iPads, our tablets, right? All of that stuff. We've got a new update. You need to install this. There are security fixes here. we want to do that. We want to make sure we're installing security fixes. If you have your own IT staff, make sure that they're installing, keeping things up to date. Ask them, how's it going? Are we keeping, are we up to date? What does it take to get us there if we're not? And just try and move that bar along. Essentially what happens is these applications, they're constantly under attack. Not just with password guessing attacks. Folks are looking for weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and trying to find a way to exploit that, take advantage of it, and use that to gain access to an end system. And so the vendors are always releasing software updates for that, as well as application enhancements. They really don't try and play up the security updates sometimes because they feel like that makes them look bad. Microsoft is pretty good about saying, hey, there's a security patch and you need to install this. So yeah, we need to make sure we're staying up to date. What happens when a patch gets released? Well, the bad guys go out and they start looking at the patch and they figure out what was broken in it, what changed essentially. And then they start scanning for that vulnerability. They build some code to take advantage of it, and they start scanning the internet, looking for any systems that are exposed to this weakness. And then they'll exploit it and get into the network. E-crime groups, they're going to use this in some way to extort you out of money, for example. And this is all these groups do. They constantly are running these things. So our goal is to not in a frantic fashion or without some testing and stuff like that, but make sure that we're promptly installing these updates so that we can keep our environment running, keep the applications we depend on running, but get the patch deployed as quickly as possible. Now, web applications are a little bit of a different beast to deal with, particularly if you have, so there's different types of web applications, right? I mentioned WordPress earlier. WordPress is this nice website that web development companies know how to create themes to give it the look that you want, and then there are plugins that we can put on it to get the functionality out of it that we desire. Like I said earlier, I use WordPress. I have plugins on there. What I do is I have another plugin that constantly updates all my plugins and keeps everything up to date, and I'm checking on it with the emails that I get with reports. So, whatever, if you're using some kind of easy deploy website, they're nice and handy. They are updated. The problem is because they're so well known, they're targeted all the time. So again, we need to make sure that we're updating those. WordPress core is the basic piece of WordPress is pretty good about security. They've had vulnerabilities and stuff, but for the most part, they do well. Most of the compromises in WordPress come through the plugins because smaller organizations, smaller groups create these plugins and they don't do security testing. They're not quite up to date on it. And then somebody breaks into it, they put something malicious up on your web page, you go to it and you click on something malicious because you think it's safe, and it exploits your system, or they get onto, they use that access to get onto the underlying computer, and then they just pivot and move it throughout, let's say, your network, and that becomes a real problem. Custom web applications, this is where you have your own web application written by, like, say, your own developers. In fact, I saw some folks in the introductions talking about their mobile applications or websites that they have that they use to interact with their customers. Those are areas that are absolutely under attack. Folks will look at that and try and find vulnerabilities. I mentioned initial access brokers in the groups of folks who attack. These are part of the e-crime world. Their whole business model is we're just really good at exploiting different websites, let's say, and then getting some level of access into the victim's network. And then once we validate that, we're just going to turn around and sell it to somebody else. They can deal with ransoms or extortion, payment, all that other stuff. What they do is it's almost like you hear business to business. Well, this is gang to gang business transactions. And so, they sell that access to somebody else for, whatever the agreed on amount is. And then that group will pull in and do the extortion. Anyhow, these initial access brokers, they're really good at this, and so I see attacks all the time that are dropping out of or executing underneath the web server application that's running, and you see them running commands on the operating system, the computer underneath, to do whatever it is they're trying to do, get additional credentials or whatever, create an account so they can log in. So those are all things that you see. As far as a defense there, well, there's tools that allow you to do scanning of your source code. There are standards out there that you should ask your developers, are they developing applications along the lines of those standards? Things still happen. Vulnerabilities occur. The point is, though, is to, again, we're raising the bar up here, making it a little bit more difficult. And then, when you find that you have, a vulnerability in your application, go back to your developers and say, here's the problem. How are we going to get this fixed? And I can talk a lot about that, actually. It's a whole rabbit hole to go down. You can also have somebody do a penetration test. I've talked about penetration tests a few times. It's something I used to do in my career. Think of this as quality assurance for security. You hire somebody with some integrity, an organization with some integrity. You would sign legal documents and stuff like that, and they perform a security test, hopefully against your development or QA web server or application or mobile app or something like that, and they see what they can find, and they tell you about that so that you can turn around and get that fixed by your developers. So that's a defense there against those types of attacks. As we get more complex with like I said, with custom web apps, things become more complex, and that does increase our costs in a number of ways. So those are the main defenses I wanted to talk about. There's always more that can be done. There are so many different security defenses out there, and if you start looking around at security service providers' websites, they will toss all kinds of terms at you about different service offerings that I haven't talked about to help you protect your organization. I can certainly talk about those in specifics when they come up, but these three areas at least start to address the three main areas where I see attackers getting into people's networks and taking a business to town. I am more than happy to ask questions. I threw a ton of information and terms at you that many folks probably are like, I don't even know what he's talking about. That's okay, just ask. I probably used some jargon in here that I shouldn't have, and I didn't even realize I did it. So if I said anything that confused you or whatnot, you want more information on, please just ask. Happy to do so. Or if it's something maybe a little more sensitive to your organization, you want to talk about it outside of the video, outside of Volley, you can just send me a direct message. We can set up a call and talk through it. I am more than happy to talk and just share ideas and hopefully help people out. I hope this was useful to everybody. And again, let me know if you have any questions. Best wishes to everybody, and hopefully this helps you protect yourselves and your organizations. Thanks. Bye.